Welcome back. Now we get political. Who would be better to start this round with than a member of the European Parliament? One that sits there on behalf of the Swedish Pirate Party. Amelia Andersdotter, in her contribution to the catalogue of Ars Electronica, picked up the idea of open source life and said, open source life is a form of politics. And she immediately said, I would love to speak about repairing democracy. That's how we start. Please welcome Amelia Andersdotter. Election.
Hi. My name is Amelia Andersdotter. I was elected into the European Parliament last year on behalf of Piratpartiet, which is a Swedish political party. That's, in Swedish we would call that rundgång. So, I was elected last year on behalf of the Swedish Pirate Party into the European Parliament. Pirate Party is a political party working with information management policy on a national level and obviously now since last year also on a European level. So I was thinking when Andreas asked me to come here this spring, I was thinking a lot about representative democracy, what it means and what it entails. And basically representative democracy is when you choose a representative to take decisions for you, right? This is what democratic elections are. You have a representative democracy, you have a representative in a parliament working full-time, taking care of all the things like taxes and healthcare and information management, or how much fish can we pick out of the North Sea. It works reasonably well because most citizens just can't take all those decisions on their own. There's not enough time. Very few people are privileged enough to devote their entire lives to political work. These are actually horseshoe crabs. They're some of the oldest living creatures in the planet. So I think about representative democracy as something like, originally it was meant to empower people and give people like the ability to choose what they want. Like every few years or so we choose a representative that supports our values and take decisions that we find good. The representative democracy has some kind of accountability system as well. So if we don't believe that our representatives have done us good, we can always not elect them in the next elections. And optimally, that is how it would work. Unfortunately, we've moved on from that. I'm quite nervous. So we've moved on from the representative democracy onto a trade agreement-based system. This is like kind of a part of globalization that we've seen. And trade agreements don't really work in the same way as representative democracy. And there's many different kinds of trade agreements. There's free trade agreements between two states, or you can have free trade agreements between a lot of states. And when it's two states only, like the EU and South Korea, they would enter into a bilateral trade agreement. Bilateral trade agreements and multilateral trade agreements, or the World Trade Organizations, are all kind of institutions that are taken away from representative democracy. And now you have this entire system, like capitalistic market system, where the market and what we do with our economy makes a lot of difference in how society is run. So this is definitely like post-representative. And this is a panda, it's a post-representative institution, because pandas are useless. And so are usually the post-representative institutions. They're completely off from accountability. We cannot choose to remove any representative of our nation from a post-representative institution. In fact, usually the only people who appoint them are in the governments. The governments are formed obviously by the majority in the parliament, but each of the departments that adhere to a government consist of bureaucrats or administrative personnel, and they tend to be quite constant regardless of who sits in the parliament or who's in the government. So this is the democratic kind of chain changing. So normally when you make decisions, you would expect there to be first the voters, and then you would expect there to be a parliament, and maybe the parliament chooses a government, because otherwise you end up with so many things in the parliament and so many different wills that you can't really make decisions comfortably. But with this system, with post-representative pandas everywhere, you instead get something like voters, parliaments, governments, departments, and then bureaucrats somewhere in an international organization where they do negotiations with many different nations, and the policy is in fact not set by the member state at all. And the European Union is kind of a crude example of that, where we still have some kind of representability through the European Parliament. But when it comes to bilateral agreements struck now, they're made by the Commission and departments in the Commission. And the Commission consists of usually one representative from each member state, and they're chosen by the governments of the member states, not at all by the voters or by the parliament. They usually have nothing to say about this. And then the commissioner has a general staff, and the general staff is kind of constant. So if you look at the Department of Trade, for instance, they're doing trade policy now with all the trade agreements being negotiated. Their executives and their administrative personnel, they've basically been in place now since, 1995? And you can do nothing about it, obviously. Even if you're Europeans and you vote, you can do nothing about that. But I'm in the parliament, so technically, maybe I should have something to say about it, but I don't, because they already have their contracts with somebody who's completely different than me, and I have nothing to say about whoever gets employed by the European Commission. So it's quite easy, is it a conspiracy? I don't really think it is. This is like the democratic institutions warping, and it's kind of like a self-perpetuating system. It's a lot of people working in a system towards some type of, in some direction. They don't really think about it. Working in the commission is a quite, prestigious task. Usually the people there speak 3 or 4 European languages. They have really long educations. They're very, very good at doing what they do. And they're also generally very intelligent people. So I don't really have anything against them as such. It's just that they aren't elected by me, or I have nothing to say about who they are. And they all have this, we have this feeling in society also that we kind of need to move in a specific direction. So trade liberalization, the way it's made now, is seen as an ultimate goal, kind of a goal in itself. And then you have all of these people sitting around looking at documents, and they say, this makes a lot of sense, into information and communications technology to promote the green environment in Africa. That's very good, because in Africa they need a clean environment also. And yeah, those are people moving in the same direction. It's actually a fish swarm. This is something a friend told to me. So I see this kind of I see representative democracy now kind of as a democratic empire. So it's been expanding for a very long time. It morphs into post-representative institutions, and then it falls, like all other empires. They've had lots of empires in the past that have been expanding either politically or geographically, like you had Napoleon, who went to Moscow, and then he fell. You had the Mongol Empire, and they went to Europe, and then they fell. And representative democracy, being also of sorts an empire that's now spreading to Africa, or why not the Middle East, will also eventually fall, if it hasn't already, with all the post-representative institutions going around. The problem a lot with post-representative institutions is not only that they govern our laws by the text in the agreements, but also that they govern our case law. Free trade agreements now set up their own arbitration systems, and that's a method of conflict resolution that on an international level works a lot like a court. So the European Union was in a case against EU and Canada, against the US and Canada about chemicals in meat, like what can you feed a cow for it to be eligible to sell the meat on the European market. Now you would expect Europeans to be able to determine this on their own and have our own kind of chemicals database. What do we want Europeans to put in their body? Well, we can't, because the WTO has decided in one of their conflict resolution panels that the European Union doesn't in fact have enough scientific support for their anti-chemicals list. And that means we have to change our legislation because of something an arbitration panel says in the WTO, like as if it were a court on a European level, while it's not. This is, I find that one of the most perhaps harmful thing about trade agreements today, the fact that they're setting up judicial systems outside of the judicial system. Now you're not supposed to have that. We have this idea about Rechtsstat, that like fair trials and accountable trials, and we have at least some amount of power what goes on in our judicial system, or we're supposed to have, and now we don't. The representative democracy is basically gone already. But I had this realization also peer-to-peer, and information and communications technology. This is different from the representative democracy. It's also different from the post-representative institutions. Information and communications technology has made it a bit more possible for citizens to globalize on their own, or people to globalize on their own, because it's not even about adhering to a specific state. It's very easy to communicate between India and the US, or you can have a friend in Australia. If you're in Europe, it's no problem. And it's, I mean, it's a grassroots globalization. It's independent of public institutions, and even if it doesn't necessarily have power over what maybe you should have power over in society if you're a citizen, it's still kind of like an autonomous system outside of that that could very well come to change a lot of things in the future. I think public institutions now are also somehow picking up on that, especially when you come to parliament level, right? The most parliamentarians already realize that they don't have a lot of power. So you had European Member of Parliament Sophie in 't Veld from the Netherlands saying regarding the ACTA negotiations, anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, that the only people who can do something about this now is the European Parliament. She's almost correct insofar as the European Parliament can choose whether or not the treaty is ratified or not. But if any of you have been following the developments of this treaty so that you know how it's negotiated completely and transparently, or by Commission representatives we don't have power over, you would also know that the European Parliament has nothing to say about what's in that agreement. And this is quite a big problem, since the agreement is so detailed. We ran some comparisons of texts between some free trade agreements signed last year by the Union and actual European legislation. Turns out they're the same. So we're essentially making on global level as detailed legislation as we would make on European level. And since the European Parliament is allowed to go into the actual legal texts when they're negotiated in Europe, you would expect them to maybe be able to do the same thing on an international level. They're in fact not. The only thing you can do is say yes or no. And in fact, you can't even do that, because if you were to say no to something like the South Korea free trade agreement, you would wreck the European automobile industry, which is not necessarily a good thing. But parliamentarians then, now this spring, we're working a lot on transparency in the negotiations, and so have lots of activists been doing since 2007. And I don't know that it's enough. Like, you also need transparency in the arbitration units here. And you need to make sure that you remove power from the extrajudicial courts. Like, we can't have all of these like kind of semi-courts on a global level dictating what type of legislation we have here. And it's just not doable. And the European Parliament did gain a lot of transparency in March this spring when they got the European Commission to make public all the negotiations documents that were available at that time. But as we've seen later in the summer, this hasn't really been a lasting impact. The European Parliament says that show us the documents now, or we will not approve this treaty later. They show the documents in April or May. And in June and July, they say, well, you can't see the documents anymore, and the public can't see them either. And insofar as we're going to tell you anything, it will be in a closed meeting that you're not allowed to disclose to anyone after the meeting is over. And this was something that really angered my colleague, Christian Engström, also from Piratpartiet, who actually even walked out of the meeting and said it's not okay to keep this away from the public. It's just not. But then is it beyond hope then? Well, I don't think so. Like, you could quite definitely make the Parliament press more ultimatums against the European Commission. It obviously works. Like, there's so much prestige in the trade negotiations for them. Most of them, they've already been undertaken for, what, 2 or 3 years? They can't afford to lose them. That might make representative democracy come back. And the European Parliament now, being the European Union moving towards a federal structure, will get more power, or will get as much power as they give themselves at any rate. And we might have to see a devolution of the system where international trade agreements are considered legislation instead, so that you and I and all of the parliamentarians and all the civilians will have detailed insight in the trade negotiations as they progress. And this is really the only way that we can bring back, I think, democracy into our current global legal regime. The fact is that most laws aren't made on a national level anymore. They're not made on a regional level like in the European Union. They're made globally to begin with, and then to have a representative democracy, you also need the transparency and the decision-making power there, and you need the representatives there. It's going to take a lot of work, and most empires from the past haven't actually been able to shrink. And that makes the representative democracy dilemma quite a bit more difficult. Like, they can't de-expand. Once they've started growing, they continue until they fall. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing how representative democracy, if it will at all be sustainable, or if it will be doable at all to continue with that system. Which is ironic, since some part of it I should technically be more positive about the thing, but I'm not so very much. So, yeah, this is the panda hanging after the representative democracy has reconquered its status. Alternatively, if the peer-to-peer revolution ends up dismantling the power of both representative democracy and post-representation. I mean, I'm not sure what will happen, but whatever it will be, it will certainly be interesting to see. And I hope that's not too dystopic, and I hope the pictures weren't too cryptic. But yeah, thank you.
I knew before that Pirate Party was fighting for the freedom of information and on issues of privacy. I did not know that they also work with voodoo puppets, but now I know. Amelia, you have changed my view of the European Parliament, besides other insights. Thank you for that.